Now I'm going to show you how we can create custom brushes to match the texture we're working on in order to provide much better seam removal and modification of the image. The photograph I've loaded in is just a picture I took of just a rock, a rather large rock. And we're going to start out by going up to Filter, Other, and selecting Offset. And now what I want to do is not offset it to the point where the seam is in the center of the image. And the reason for that is since we're going to be using the clone stamp tool to remove the seam, we don't want a limited amount of space to work with. So this way we can increase our range if we reduce the offset amount. I'm going to go ahead and use 600 by 600 just because this is a rather large image. And click OK. And now we have a nice sampling area where we don't need to worry about getting out of range. And with the offset, we can also see how well the overall tones will match up throughout the image. And we can see that some of the tones do need to be adjusted. For the most part, this image has a pretty good range and it's pretty equal. But we do need to balance this out a little. So what we're going to do is go up to Image, Adjustments, and select the Shadows and Highlights filter. And you want to make sure that the Show More options is on. And what we want to do is just give a nice balance. The default settings I have right now are going to be far too high. So I'm going to reduce the tonal width of the shadow removal. And the radius will basically adjust the size of the removal, or at least how much is left over of our shadow. So a larger radius is going to leave more of the shadow and those range, and it's basically our sampling range. We could reduce that, and that'll even out a little bit better. If we increase the tonal width of our highlights, we can remove the brighter areas of the scene, and it's a good idea just to pay attention to the seams and the image on both sides of it to really check for a good consistency of that tone variation, because of course we don't want it to drastically change, and that's not going to make a very good texture. Now the amount you really want to adjust is of course up to you. Every texture is different. Whether or not you want to preserve more of the original look, or if you're just using source photographs to create unique textures, then some of these values you can really crank up to give a good consistent tone and create a good seamless texture. I'm going to try to preserve as much of the original image as possible and just increase the radius of our highlight a little and give us a good balance. I'm going to turn down the color correction a little bit to just around 50. The color correction will basically increase your hues for darker areas and give a little bit of a better balance. Sometimes the value of 100 is a little bit too much. We can adjust the mid-tone contrast, and you can see that creates a very drastic effect throughout the image. So really depending on what you want out of the texture, these settings can be tweaked and modified as far as you want. Now there's a couple of things we need to keep in mind when we're correcting the seam. One of the most important things is to have absolutely no transparency in the brush. The reason for this is if there's any transparency, the seam might not get covered, and also you'll possibly end up repeating some of the patterns over on top of each other and parts of the image getting duplicated, and what's going to happen is you're going to have a very weird faded look that's caused by that. And I can show you that really quick just by using a low hardness clone stamp, just a basic brush. I'm just going to go ahead with clone stamp selected, hit Alt to select a sampling area. I'm using the aligned mode, and that way our selection will move and pick up from where we left off. And a nice thing in Photoshop CS4 is we can see what we're sampling while we're painting it. Now, right now we can see that I have a circle around the size of my brush. What you can do is hit caps lock in order to hide that. And now we can see the sample. So if I start to paint over this, for the most part it looks like it's doing a pretty good job, but around the edges of where the brush is sampling, it's getting very blurred, and that blur is caused by the transparency and not having a consistent overlay. So the more times we go over it and keep going over it, if we change our sample to maybe a different area, go over that again, eventually we're going to be able to really see where the seams originally were by the blur that shows up. So I'm going to go back and just delete all of these clone stamps and get back to our seam where we had it. And what we want to do is use elements from the photograph in order to pick out the kind of detail and the shapes and patterns that already exist within the texture, because we can use those to our advantage. There's a couple of different ways to create brushes. For the most part, they come from a selection. One thing you could do is use the magic wand tool or the quick selection tool. Either one works pretty well. The combination of the two will work best. I'm going to start out with the magic wand tool. I'm going to go up to the top and set our tolerance up to 25. Make sure the continuous mode is on, otherwise it's going to sample everything in the image that's similar to the selection. And I'm going to keep anti-aliasing off because I do not want any sort of opacity change around the edge. I want pretty much as harsh of a cutoff as possible. A little bit of opacity might be okay. Whether or not the anti-aliasing mode is going to make a huge impact, depending on the scale of the brush, really is going to depend on the texture you're working on, but I do like to keep all transparency out of seam removal. So what you can do is select an area of the image, just a nice little bit of detail, and now we have a selection, and we basically have a brush. So even just using this already, just this one selection, with a nice little pattern from the shape of the rock, what we can do is go up to Edit and select Define Brush Preset. And then you can give it a name and save that out. And you'll be able to select that from the clone stamp menu. If we wanted to add to this, instead of just using the direct selection, what we could do is go to the quick selection tool and maybe change our brush a little. And if I hit caps lock, I'll be able to see the size of my brush again. So if maybe we didn't want all of that randomness in the center, maybe just around the edges, we can then use the quick selection tool to add to our selection, or use it to pick out some other pieces. And this is a good way to pull very defined elements out of the scene. It's not quite so random as the magic wand tool, although you can still produce some really good results, especially with both of them together. Because if we wanted to have these nice little edges and blends with the image, we can do that. Another way we can get a brush out of the image is to basically pick out a piece we want to use and set up a new document in order to modify the image and pull out what we want. And this will give you a little more control and also the ability to go back and modify the brush if you need to make any changes, rather than having to make a work path, which in most cases won't turn out very well. So what we can do is just select a piece of the photograph that has a good variation. So we have some of these flat areas, dark and light, and all little flecks and little bumps we have showing up. So we just want to get as much as we possibly can out of our selection. And another thing to keep in mind is the scale. If you want to match the brush size to the source, then you want to make sure you're using a much smaller selection. In this case, what would happen is if we were using, let's go ahead and just make a smaller selection. And let's say we created a brush out of some of the elements within this selection, and we started to clone stamp that. We would have a good size because we're not really going to have a brush much larger than the selection area. And that way we wouldn't really have to modify the scale. We're going to be using some of the dynamics of the custom brushes in order to distribute the overall pattern. But this allows you to keep the consistency of scale within the image. Now, this image has a lot of different variations for the size, the patterns, and the bumps. So the initial brush size isn't going to matter too much. We can scale it, change it, reduce it, increase it, and it should work really well, especially for textures like this where we have so much randomness. So I'm going to go back and make that new selection. I'm just using the marquee tool. You can hit M on the keyboard or go to your palette, and depending on if you're using the elliptical, rectangular, which one will show up. But I'm just using the rectangular marquee tool. And just go back and make that selection. And now I can hit Control-C on the keyboard, copy, and I'm also going to hit Control-N for a new document. You could also go to File and New, or all of the copy-paste commands cut are under the Edit menu. So I'm just going to call this Brush Custom, and we can keep the settings all the same, or basically the default that's going to show up because they are derived from the document we're working on. Go ahead and hit Control-V to paste that in, or Edit and Paste. And now what I'm immediately going to do is just make a copy of this layer to preserve what I currently have. So we could just click and drag down over the new layer icon and then turn off the first layer. And now we can work with the copy, and if we want to go back, then we have this duplicate. What you could also do is go to the History menu and just create a snapshot, which is this little icon here between New Document from Current State and the trash can. So I'll just go ahead and create a new snapshot as well. So we can always go back to this current state if we wanted to. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to minimize these, select our layer, and now what I'm going to do is just modify and create a black and white version to pull out which detail we want, and then we can modify from there. So what I'm going to do is go to Image, Adjustments, and select the black and white filter. This allows us to adjust the black and white tones based on the color of the original image. It's also really nice because with the sampler, what we can do is just click directly on the image and move it to the right to increase the brightness, move it to the left to decrease the brightness. So you can grab an area of the photograph you want to reduce or increase the value, and it's pretty helpful rather than just having a direct conversion where we're just desaturating and then we don't really get a lot of control over our tones. So what we're going to do is use the white areas in order to define the brush. So we could just keep that in mind while we're adjusting the black and white variation. When we're ready, we can just go ahead and click OK. And we do need to make sure that we have a very constant color, so I do want black and white, and really no grayscale in between. So I'm going to hit Control L to open up levels. What we can also do is go to Image, Adjustment, and select Levels. Or use whichever tool you feel most comfortable with to adjust this amount of contrast. Curves also works really well and is pretty nice. So we can go ahead and adjust this to really black out some of the areas. You're going to notice a lot of speckled parts showing up, and those are actually going to be kind of helpful to us. So I don't want those entirely removed. And we also want to make sure that we have still a good amount of variation without removing everything. So once we have something fairly close, you could either go back into the levels and redo that again. But what I'm going to do is go up to Image and Adjustments and use the threshold, which will allow us to adjust through the image what we currently have to pull out the black and white areas. Using levels gives us a little more control to begin with before we use the threshold, although you could immediately start out with the threshold rather than using levels or curves or anything like that first. So what the threshold is going to do is give us a direct black and white image. So basically an indexed black and white image. And that's going to make it a lot easier to work with what we have. Now you can make modifications if you don't like little flecks that are showing up, keeping in mind that most of the filters you would use to remove those sort of artifacts are going to cause a bit of transparency within the edge of the brush or around it, inside of it. Sometimes that might be what you need to do, but in this case we're going to keep it where it's at. If I was to go ahead and use a Gaussian blur, what we're going to see is that little bit of transparency that's going to end up in our brush, and we don't want that. So now we need to make a selection from this, because we're not going to have a square brush. We're not going to be sampling the whole area. And what we can do is use the lasso tool and outline some of the areas. For this, you'd want to really outline and make your selection within the black areas and not go directly through a large chunk, just because you're going to get some weird effects. And you can see as I'm going through here, I'm just kind of randomly moving the lasso tool up and down just to prevent as much cleanup as possible. So we can go and just kind of outline which area we want. And the more erratic the shape, really the better. Although we don't want it to be too defining, because we will be repeating this kind of over and over. So now what I'm going to do is hit Control-C to copy from our selection, Control-V to paste. And just so we can see the brush a little better, I'm going to add a new layer. Make sure our color is set to black, RGB at 0. Use the paint bucket tool, paint in the layer, and just stick that underneath the brush selection. So this is going to be our primary brush. And I say primary because we also have the ability to use a subtracting brush and a secondary brush within the overall shape. So we can go back into this image and now select something that looks different from the brush we currently have. Maybe some of the elements that didn't get picked out, to kind of run through it. And we do want to make sure that's a different size as well, to give us more variation within the image and within our brush. So I'm going to select some of the sampled areas at the top, go back to our lasso tool, and just outline another piece from our shape we've created. And then we can copy and paste, stick that above our black background, and just take a look. Now if you see any really harsh or square shapes you want to get rid of, the best thing to do is use the lasso tool again and just kind of quickly jitter that around and delete it. Just because most brushes, unless you're using the pencil mode, will create the opacity. And this can be just really quick, so we don't have to spend a lot of time. We're going to take a look at our other selection, and I'm just going to create a little more variation around the edges, some of these areas. Making sure I'm in the correct layer. Okay, so now we have what we can make our selections from for our brush. Now we do want to make sure, so that we can get a nice preview, that these need to be black, at least the sampled area for the brush. So we do need to invert. So we can hit Control-I for each of the layers to invert them, or you can go to Image, Adjustments, and Invert, and just do that for both of the layers. I'm going to keep the black background off so we can see the brush a little better. And now we're going to make our selection using the magic wand tool, turning off the continuous mode. And the reason for this is once we select the black, it's going to select every single area of black within the layer. Make sure anti-aliasing is turned off. Because we just have a constant color, the tolerance amount really isn't going to matter too much. 25 will be fine. 0 will probably select the same area. So we can just select the black. And actually, I'm going to do this for our primary first. And make sure we're in the right layer. And now select the black area of the primary brush. We can go up to Edit, Define Brush Preset, and I'm going to call this Texture Rock Primary. Deselect, and now select the other brush, Edit, Define Brush Preset, Texture Rock, and Second. So you could save out that brush if you wanted to. It's also a good idea to basically create a new document rather than working with the source image, which in this case I am. Now, I have multiple copies of this, so it's not really a huge deal for me if the file gets overwritten. But what you typically want to do, and what we can do just by going to the history to make it easier, is create a new document from the current state, which is now named deselect, which was the last option that was used, or tool, showing up in the history. And then you can go ahead and close out the source image, keeping in mind you will lose the other history states. And now we have a new file we can work with and not have to worry about overwriting the source image. Always something to keep in mind. Okay, so now we can set up our clone stamp brush. Select the clone stamp tool, and now you'll need to open the brushes menu. I have mine separated. You can go up to Window and select Brushes, F5 the default, and what we want to do is first we have our brush presets, and we're going to see the samples we just created right at the end of this list. So we first have the primary and then the secondary. Keeping in mind too that we can also see the pixel amount of the source image. So we'll select the primary first, which is also our brush tip shape. And the selections you made will also show up in your shapes, but not necessarily in the order in which you saved them, which can get a little confusing. So starting out from the initial preset can usually work a little bit better. So now we can adjust the spacing in between our brushes and each sample that's created. The overall diameter, for the most part, this overall diameter doesn't really matter because we can adjust that within the photograph while we're working on it. We're going to go to Shape Dynamics, and what we want is a little bit of a size jitter. I'm going to turn off the control. I'm not going to be using a pressure sensitive tablet for this just because it's fairly easy to do with the mouse. And what we can do is just have it change its overall size, the control just being a constant, something that's just going to kind of be random. We could set up a minimum diameter if we want. Angle jitter will allow us to rotate the brush around, which is one thing we want a pretty high amount of, because if we have the same shape throughout the entire sample, then that's going to defeat the purpose of trying to remove those sort of patterns and creating a custom brush for that. The roundness will squish our brush on the different axes. I'm going to keep the roundness jitter very low, just because I don't want those really squished samples. And I just have all my controls off. If you're using Wacom tablet, something like that, then you could set your controls to pen pressure if you want, tilt, or you could use the stylus wheel. And if you're using paths or anything like that, you could set to rotation, direction, things like that. Okay, so now we're going to go to scattering, which will allow us to separate the brush from the initial line. We can adjust the count, and whether or not we want to scatter it on both axes. I'm going to keep both axes off, give us a decent amount of scatter, but we're still just working with the one brush. So now what we can do is go to our dual brush, and we can select the secondary sample that we created. And I have a couple of my test ones I created earlier, but this should be the one I just made. So what we can do is now adjust our subtraction brush within the primary, and I'm going to give this a good amount of spacing, scattering, increase the count, because we still want to see a bit of the brush showing up. We don't want to subtract everything, but this will just give us a nice extra bit of dispersion throughout the brush and a pretty good sample. Increase our scatter a little, and I'm going to go back to scattering and just increase that a little bit more. Increase the count, and we can adjust the count jitter too, so how many changes for how many samples are created. Sometimes they'll create a nice little cluster, sometimes very sparse, so the jitter amount will adjust that. So once we have that ready to go, we can minimize the brush panel. Now we can see a very large sample showing up. So we can right mouse click, decrease the size of the brush to something a little more manageable. And then once we're ready, we can hold down Alt on the keyboard, select our area we'd like to sample from, and just drag that across. So we can see it grabbing very randomly and placing the texture along the seam. We do want to make sure the mode is set to normal. Opacity is 100%, flow at 100, and I'm currently using the aligned mode. Opacity amount and flow, really important when you're working on the initial seam. We could increase the scatter amount because it looks like maybe this isn't scattering enough. Because we do want something that's really going to jump around. And maybe reduce that a little. Looks like a little bit too much. Go ahead and bring that down. So now we can move along the seam and just remove the texture that way. Remove our seam and very quickly and easily create a nice blend. And then we can go back over the image with our different blending modes. So you want to start with just the normal mode to remove the seam. Once the seam's gone, making sure that it is gone from every area of your texture, of your photograph, because you don't want to have the sample area go over a seam, because then it's going to copy it everywhere, and especially if you're not using the aligned mode, because then it's going to keep grabbing from that same area, and if there's a seam, you're just going to duplicate a seam all over the texture and kind of destroy it. So something to pay attention to. But now what we can do is use some of the other blend modes. The two most non-destructive modes are going to be the darken and lighten. And what I mean by non-destructive is to the point where the pattern isn't going to be showing up within the tiling. So, for example, if we were to select something like color burn and paint that, you can see some really dark spots. And for the most part, a lot of the blend modes are going to not work so well, where it's going to differ too much from the rest of the image. Lighten works really well, just grabbing the light areas, but keeping in mind this does duplicate some of the distinct features that might repeat themselves. So there's another option and some really cool controls for the clone stamp, and that's in the clone source panel or window. So if you go to window, you can select clone source. I've got mine in a button here. What you can do is adjust the sampling area. Information in the offset is basically where you've sampled. You could fine-tune that if you want. You can also have multiple clone sources. So if you want to switch in between a saved preset, you can move to another clone source. But one of the things that's most useful for creating a seamless texture is the rotation. And what you can do is reverse the direction of the sample, make it opposite the brush, or basically have an angle offset from the sample. So let's go ahead and just set up 180 degrees. So I'm going to choose a sample area, and so you can see this a little bit better. Switch to normal. And now when I click at the top of the screen and start to move down to the bottom of the image, we're sampling from our initial spot and moving the opposite direction, upward. So instead of repeating the patterns in the same direction over and over when you're cloning, what you can do is adjust the rotation amount. And you could use a little bit of a different value. I'll go ahead and use 45 degrees. And that'll give us a little bit of a better sample. And that way we're not copying over the same patterns in the same direction anyway. In this case, we can see that I've copied this pattern. Let's go ahead and zoom in. And we can see that this pattern on the right was sampled over to the left, but because I had that 45-degree angle, it is now rotated. So instead of showing up in exactly the same direction and placement, we can rotate it and change the sample in order to create a much more random texture and not have any of those elements repeating themselves, showing the tiling effect. Because although the whole point of a seamless texture is to tile it, the tiling effect is the repeating of very distinct elements. In this case, these shadows with the coloration underneath it, where you would see that repeating over and over, and it'd be very obvious that you're using a smaller image repeated to create a texture. So those are some really, really useful techniques you can use while you're working on textures. If you're fixing seams or modifying current textures, trying to remove some of the detail elements and distinct areas, those can be some very helpful tools. And I also want to make a note that it is really important that anytime you do any sort of clone stamping on a texture and you get close to an edge, or especially using the scatter brush, you always replace the offset back where it was. So you can go to Filter, Other, Offset, and it's usually going to remember the last setting you had. And all you need to do is just create an opposite version. So we can change the pluses to negatives. So we're subtracting 600 by 600. And now we can check and see if any seams have been created by removing the seams, which can happen, especially when you're working around the edges, and you do have to work around the edges in order to get a perfectly seamless texture. So a lot of the time you'll end up creating seams around the edge, and it's always a good idea to use the exact same offset consistently, going forward and going back. And the reason for this is then once you find a seam, you can add a guide. And I have the rulers open under View, Rulers, so you can just select in the ruler to create either a horizontal or a vertical guide. So once you find a seam, you could set up a guide and check along those lines in order to find any other seams. And by always using the same values, so if I was to offset this again, I would want to use another value of 600. And that way, if any seams are going to be created, they will always be created in the same spot. And that way you don't have seams randomly showing up throughout the entire texture, and that can require a lot more cleanup and more work than is needed.